Patton was right all along. I see it now.
We must act now, and the MO will know. Stay sharp, be ready for anything. Dismissed.
The relationship between General Omar Bradley and General George Patton was one of the most complex and emotionally fraught partnerships in American military history. For years, Bradley had dismissed many of Patton's ideas as the reckless fantasies of a glory-seeking cowboy, had resented Patton's flamboyance and self-promotion, and had believed that his own methodical, casualty-conscious approach to warfare was superior to Patton's aggressive risk-taking. But there came a moment, a specific point in time when the scales fell from Bradley's eyes, and he realized with stunning clarity that Patton had been right about something fundamental.
Gentlemen, the operation commences at dawn. Precision is paramount. Any deviation risks everything.
Yes, sir.
Good. Dismissed. Gentlemen, the reports confirm enemy movement here. We must act immediately. Mobilize all units now.
Something that Bradley's own caution and conventional thinking had prevented him from seeing. That moment of recognition, when it came, was both professionally illuminating and personally devastating for Bradley. It forced him to reconsider not just a specific operational decision, but his entire assessment of Patton's strategic vision and his own limitations as a commander. This is the story of that moment and what it revealed about both men, about the nature of military leadership, and about the costs of choosing caution over audacity. To understand the significance of Bradley's moment of realization, we need to understand the fundamental differences in how these two men approached warfare. Bradley was the epitome.
The situation is critical. We must mobilize our forces immediately and end the advancing fire. Enemy positions have shifted. We must act now. Understood, sir. Your orders? Mobilize immediately. Precision is critical.
Of the professional soldier who valued careful planning, methodical execution, and above all, the preservation of his soldiers' lives. He had risen through the ranks through competence and reliability, rather than brilliance or charisma. He was known as the GI's general because he genuinely cared about the welfare of his troops and made decisions designed to minimize casualties, even if that meant slower progress toward objectives. Bradley's approach to warfare was fundamentally conservative in the technical sense of that word. He sought to husband resources, avoid unnecessary risks,
We don't move now. Follow me. Let's go.
and achieve objectives through the application of overwhelming force rather than through clever maneuver or audacious gambles. Patton's approach could not have been more different. He believed that speed and momentum were weapons in themselves, that pursuit of a beaten enemy should be relentless, regardless of logistical constraints, and that the greatest sin a commander could commit was giving the enemy time to recover. Patton was willing to accept higher casualties if he believed that aggressive action would shorten the war and ultimately save lives. He thought in terms of destroying enemy armies rather than merely pushing them back, of exploiting breakthroughs to their maximum potential rather than consolidating gains, and of maintaining offensive pressure, even when conventional military doctrine suggested pausing to reorganize and resupply. Throughout the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and France, Bradley had watched Patton operate with a mixture of admiration and disapproval. He acknowledged Patton's tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire troops to extraordinary performance. But he also believed that Patton was reckless, that his advances often outran his supply lines dangerously, and that his headline-grabbing operations sometimes achieved more publicity than substantive military results. Bradley saw himself as the steady professional who focused on the mission rather than the glory, and he believed that his approach was ultimately more effective than Patton's theatrics. The specific issue on which Bradley would come to realize Patton had been right all along concerned the Allied strategy in the autumn of 1944, following the spectacular breakout from Normandy and the race across France. By late August and early September 1944, Allied forces had advanced far more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. German forces in France had been shattered, Paris had been liberated, and Allied armies were approaching Germany's western border. The question facing Allied commanders was what to do next, and this question generated one of the most significant strategic debates of the entire war. Patton's position was clear and forcefully argued. He believed that Third Army should be given priority for fuel and supplies, that it should continue its advance toward the German border and beyond with maximum speed, and that the opportunity existed to drive deep into Germany before German forces could establish coherent defensive lines. Patton argued that the German army was on the verge of complete collapse, that one more push could end the war before Christmas 1944, and that logistical constraints could be overcome through improvisation and captured enemy supplies. He wanted all available resources concentrated on his Third Army for what he envisioned as a knockout blow that would carry American forces to the Rhine and possibly beyond. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a different plan. He proposed Operation Market Garden, an ambitious airborne operation combined with armored thrust through Holland toward the Rhine. Montgomery argued that his northern route offered the best opportunity for a decisive breakthrough, and that he should receive priority for supplies and reinforcements. Like Patton, Montgomery believed that concentrated resources on a single thrust offered better prospects than a broad advance along the entire front. Bradley's position was more nuanced and ultimately reflected Eisenhower's thinking. He favored what became known as the broad front strategy, where all Allied armies would advance together, maintaining a continuous front line and systematically clearing German forces from occupied territories. Bradley argued that this approach was more sustainable logistically, that it prevented dangerous gaps from opening in the Allied line, and that it was more reliable than gambling everything on a single thrust that might fail. When Eisenhower made the decision to adopt the broad front strategy, Bradley supported it fully, believing it was the prudent and professional approach. Patton was furious when his request for priority in supplies was denied. He argued vociferously with Bradley and with Eisenhower, claiming that they were prolonging the war through excessive caution, that they were sacrificing a genuine opportunity to end the conflict quickly because of timidity and concern for logistical niceties. He made his views known to anyone who would listen, including war correspondents, creating public controversy over the strategy debate. Bradley found Patton's behavior inappropriate and his arguments unpersuasive. The broad front strategy seemed sensible and sound, and Bradley believed that Patton's proposed dash across Germany was exactly the kind of reckless gamble that could lead to disaster. September 1944 saw the implementation of the broad front strategy. Supply shortages affected all Allied armies as logistics struggled to keep up with the rapid advance. Patton's Third Army, despite his scrounging and improvisation, eventually ground to a halt due to lack of fuel. Montgomery's Operation Market Garden was launched in mid-September and failed, suffering heavy casualties and failing to achieve its objectives. The German border was reached, but German forces were able to establish defensive lines along the Siegfried Line fortifications. The war, which had seemed on the verge of ending in September, would continue for 8 more months. Bradley's moment of realization that Patton had been right all along did not come immediately. In the autumn of 1944, Bradley still believed that the broad front strategy had been correct, that the supply situation had made Patton's proposed offensive impossible, regardless of its theoretical merits, and that the setback was temporary. He thought that the steady, methodical approach would ultimately prove superior to the kind of wild gamble Patton had proposed. Bradley was comfortable with his decisions and confident that time would vindicate them. The moment of realization came later, and it came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual dawning of understanding that crystallized into certainty during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, Bradley watched as Patton performed what many military historians consider the most impressive operational maneuver of his career. In response to Eisenhower's desperate call for help, Patton disengaged 3 divisions from active combat operations, turned his entire army 90 degrees, moved hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles through winter weather on icy roads, and launched a coordinated attack against the German flank within 72 hours. What Bradley witnessed during those 72 hours fundamentally changed his understanding of what Patton had been proposing in September. Bradley had thought Patton's plan to drive rapidly toward Germany was reckless and logistically impossible. But watching Third Army's performance during the Battle of the Bulge, Bradley realized that Patton could have done exactly what he had proposed. If Third Army could achieve this level of operational performance in the middle of winter, under emergency conditions, while disengaging from active combat, then surely it could have achieved even more in September, when German forces were in full retreat and before they had time to establish defensive positions. The specific moment when this realization crystallized for Bradley came during a meeting at Eisenhower's headquarters in early January 1945, after the Battle of the Bulge had been contained, but while fighting was still ongoing. Patton was present, along with other senior commanders, discussing plans for future operations. Patton made a comment, almost in passing, about how Third Army's relief of Bastogne had demonstrated that the supposed logistical impossibility of his September offensive had been just an excuse for timidity. He said that if Third Army could move that far that fast in the worst possible conditions, imagine what it could have accomplished in September with retreating Germans and better weather. Bradley's first instinct was to dismiss this as typical Patton braggadocio, the kind of self-congratulatory Monday morning quarterbacking that Patton specialized in. But as Bradley thought about it, really thought about it for the first time without the preconceptions and biases that had colored his earlier assessments, he realized that Patton was right. The logistical arguments against Patton's September offensive had been real, but they had also been excuses. The fuel existed in Allied supply depots. It just wasn't at the front. The transportation capacity existed. It just would have required prioritizing Third Army over other units. The operation Patton proposed was difficult and risky, but it was not impossible. What Bradley realized in that moment was that the decision to deny Patton the resources for his September offensive had not been based primarily on logistical impossibility, but on risk aversion. He and Eisenhower had chosen the safer, more conservative option not because Patton's plan couldn't work, but because they weren't willing to accept the risk that it might not work. They had chosen certain mediocrity over possible excellence, and that choice had cost months of war and thousands of lives. This realization was devastating for Bradley on multiple levels. Professionally, it meant acknowledging that a strategic decision he had supported and defended was wrong, that Patton's judgment had been better than his own, and that his preference for methodical caution over aggressive risk-taking had prolonged the war. Personally, it meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that his resentment of Patton, his dismissal of Patton's ideas as reckless showing off, had been rooted partly in jealousy and in his own limitations as a commander. Bradley never publicly acknowledged this realization during the war. He continued to support the broad front strategy in official communications and to defend the decisions made in September 1944. But those close to Bradley during this period, his staff officers and confidants, noticed a change in his attitude toward Patton and toward operational planning more generally. Bradley became less dismissive of Patton's proposals, more willing to consider aggressive operations even when they involved substantial risk, and more conscious of the costs of excessive caution. The evidence of Bradley's changed attitude appeared in his decision-making during the final months of the war. When Patton proposed aggressive operations in early 1945, Bradley was more supportive than he had been previously. He allocated resources to Third Army more generously and interfered less with Patton's operational decisions. He defended Patton's aggressive tactics to Eisenhower rather than joining in criticism of them. This represented a significant shift from Bradley's earlier approach, and it reflected his recognition that Patton's instincts about exploitation and pursuit were better than his own, more conservative inclinations. The moment of realization also affected how Bradley thought about the nature of military leadership and the relationship between risk and reward in warfare. He had always believed that good commanders minimized risk, that protecting soldiers' lives was the highest priority, and that methodical approaches were superior to gambles. What he came to understand was that this philosophy, while admirable in many respects, could itself be a form of recklessness. By being too cautious, by refusing to accept short-term risks for potential long-term gains, Bradley realized that he had actually increased the total cost of the war in both lives and time. This is a subtle but important insight about military leadership. The obvious risks are those associated with aggressive action, with attacks that might fail, with advances that might be cut off. These risks are easy to see and quantify, and risk-averse commanders naturally focus on avoiding them. But there are also risks associated with inaction and excessive caution, risks that are less obvious but potentially more costly. By failing to exploit German weakness in September 1944, the Allies gave Germany time to reorganize, to establish defensive lines, and to launch the Ardennes offensive. The total casualties from this prolonged war almost certainly exceeded what would have been lost in an aggressive September offensive, even if that offensive had encountered serious difficulties. Bradley's realization forced him to confront this reality. Patton had understood it instinctively, had always known that maintaining pressure and accepting tactical risks could reduce overall casualties by shortening the war. Bradley had dismissed this as the rationalization of a reckless glory seeker, but the Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated its truth. If the war had ended in 1944, as Patton believed it could have, the Battle of the Bulge and its thousands of casualties would never have happened. The extended fighting along the Siegfried Line, the bitter winter battles, the prolonged suffering of populations still under Nazi control, all of this could potentially have been avoided. Bradley's memoirs, published years after the war, contain passages that hint at his changed understanding, though he never explicitly stated that Patton had been right about the September 1944 strategy debate. He wrote about the difficulty of balancing risk against potential reward, about the costs of excessive caution, and about his respect for Patton's operational instincts. Reading between the lines, knowing the history, one can see Bradley wrestling with the realization that his own judgment had been flawed on one of the most important strategic decisions of the war. The relationship between Bradley and Patton in the final months of the war and afterward was complicated by Bradley's unspoken realization. Bradley could not publicly admit that Patton had been right without undermining his own credibility and reputation. He could not acknowledge his mistake without calling into question the broad front strategy that had been the foundation of Allied operations for months. But he also could not completely suppress his recognition that Patton's aggressive instincts had been strategically sound and that his own caution had been excessive. This created a strange dynamic where Bradley was simultaneously more supportive of Patton's operations and more resentful of Patton personally. Supporting Patton's aggressive operations in early 1945 was an implicit acknowledgement that such operations could succeed and should have been attempted earlier. But this acknowledgement made Bradley more rather than less resentful of Patton, because it confronted Bradley with his own error in judgment. It's a common psychological phenomenon. We often resent most those people who force us to recognize our own limitations. The moment Bradley realized Patton was right all along was not a moment of reconciliation between the two men. If anything, it deepened the distance between them, because Bradley could neither acknowledge his realization to Patton nor completely ignore its implications. Patton, characteristically, seemed unaware of Bradley's internal struggle. He continued to complain about resources and constraints, continued to push for more aggressive operations, and continued to believe that Bradley's caution was holding back more decisive action. He never knew that Bradley had come to agree with him about the strategic opportunity that had been missed in September 1944. The historical significance of Bradley's realization extends beyond the personal relationship between two generals. It speaks to one of the fundamental debates in military theory about the proper balance between audacity and prudence in operational planning. The German military tradition, particularly as exemplified in concepts like Auftragstaktik and the writings of theorists like Clausewitz, emphasized the importance of seizing opportunities even at substantial risk. The British military tradition, particularly as shaped by the experience of World War I, emphasized careful preparation and overwhelming force to minimize casualties. The American military, during World War II, was somewhere between these traditions. Different American commanders embodied different points on this spectrum, with Patton representing the German-influenced emphasis on audacity and exploitation, and Bradley representing a more British-influenced emphasis on systematic operations and casualty minimization. The September 1944 strategy debate was essentially a test of which approach was correct in the specific circumstances of that moment. Bradley's realization that Patton had been right suggests that in that specific case, audacity would have been superior to prudence. But it's important not to overgeneralize from this conclusion. There were other times during the war when Patton's aggressive instincts led him into difficulties, when his willingness to take risks created problems rather than opportunities. The slapping incidents in Sicily, his tendency to outrun his supply lines, his occasional failure to adequately secure his flanks, all of these were consequences of the same aggressive temperament that made him so effective in pursuit operations. What Bradley came to understand was not that aggression is always better than caution, but that the specific circumstances of September 1944 had called for Patton's approach rather than his own. The German army was in retreat and disorganized. Allied forces had momentum. Supply difficulties, while real, were not insurmountable. These specific conditions created a window of opportunity that called for the kind of aggressive exploitation that Patton specialized in. By the time Bradley fully understood this, the window had closed. The counterfactual question of what would have happened if Patton had been given the resources he requested in September 1944 is one of the great what-ifs of World War II. Would his offensive have succeeded in reaching the Rhine and penetrating into Germany as he predicted? Would it have ended the war in 1944? Or would it have stalled due to logistical difficulties, creating an exposed salient that German forces could have counterattacked? We cannot know for certain, and historians continue to debate the question. What we do know is that Bradley came to believe that the attempt should have been made, that the potential rewards justified the risks, and that Patton's operational instincts had been superior to his own in this instance. This belief, based on Bradley's observation of Third Army's performance during the Battle of the Bulge and his reassessment of the September 1944 situation, represents an important historical judgment from someone who was in a position to evaluate the possibilities realistically. Bradley's moment of realization also had implications for his post-war career and his contributions to military thought. As Army Chief of Staff, and later as the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bradley had to make strategic decisions that involved balancing risk against potential reward. His experience with the September 1944 strategy debate and his recognition that excessive caution could be as dangerous as excessive audacity informed his approach to these post-war challenges. He became more willing to consider aggressive operations and less dismissive of plans that involved substantial risk. In his later years, Bradley occasionally spoke about the difficulty of strategic decision-making and the impossibility of knowing with certainty whether a decision was correct until events had played out. He acknowledged that some of the decisions he had supported during the war had not worked out as well as hoped, and that alternative approaches might have been better. While he never explicitly identified the September 1944 strategy debate as one of these problematic decisions, those familiar with the history could read the subtext in his comments. The personal cost to Bradley of realizing that Patton had been right all along was substantial, Bradley was a proud man who took his responsibilities seriously and who wanted to be remembered as a great commander. Acknowledging even privately that his judgment had been inferior to Patton's on a crucial strategic question was painful. It meant accepting that the man he had often dismissed as a showboat and a glory hound had better strategic instincts than he did, that Patton's aggressive confidence was based on genuine understanding rather than merely on ego. This recognition complicated Bradley's feelings about Patton in ways that persisted for the rest of his life. When Patton died in December 1945, Bradley's reaction was complex. He mourned the loss of a colleague and acknowledged Patton's contributions to victory. But he also felt a sense of relief that he would never have to publicly confront the question of whether Patton had been right about the September 1944 strategy. With Patton dead, Bradley could maintain the official narrative about the broad front strategy being correct while privately wrestling with his doubts. The moment Bradley realized Patton was right all along was not a moment of dramatic revelation or emotional confrontation. It was a quiet recognition that came gradually and was never fully articulated even to Bradley's closest confidants. But it was real, it was significant, and it changed how Bradley thought about leadership, strategy, and the relationship between risk and prudence in warfare. It forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own limitations and about the costs of the decisions he had supported. In the broader context of military history, Bradley's realization reminds us that even the best commanders make mistakes, that strategic decisions made under uncertainty can look very different in retrospect, and that the line between prudence and excessive caution is often clearer in hindsight than in the moment. It also reminds us that personal relationships and institutional cultures can bias strategic decision-making in subtle ways, that resentment of a colleague's personality can lead to dismissal of that colleague's ideas, and that professional jealousy can masquerade as strategic disagreement. The story of the moment Bradley realized Patton was right all along is ultimately a story about humility, about the difficulty of acknowledging error, and about the costs of decisions made in wartime. Bradley was a good commander and a decent man who made what he believed was the right decision in September 1944. That the decision may have been wrong, that an alternative approach might have ended the war sooner and saved lives, is a burden that Bradley carried for the rest of his life. His realization that Patton had been right was both a moment of professional insight and a moment of personal reckoning, and it speaks to the enormous weight of responsibility that rests on the shoulders of those who make strategic decisions in war.